time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I want to talk next about a story that almost manages to break down the tribal divides that have crippled our country in so many ways in the last few years. Because I obviously I don't hold much truck with the current crop of Conservative politicians. I was personally a little bit more minded to give the benefit of the doubt of the previous generation. The barefaced lying that typifies Boris Johnson's entire career simply can't be laid at the feet of Theresa May or David Cameron. I'm just suggesting their faults were of an altogether smaller stature. You know, whether you're looking at the moral deprivation that has typified Boris Johnson's personal, private and professional life since the year, well, even his school days, actually, if you read that infamous report from his former housemaster. It seems to me unfair, and you might not like this, but it seems to me unfair to tar the entire Conservative Party with the brush of Boris Johnson. I mean, he is clearly a million miles away from a Theresa May or from a Rory Stewart, who, of course, is no longer in the party. And what am I trying to say? You remember the hugger hoodie stuff? I thought that Cameron meant some of it. I thought that he was sincere, even if he was wrong. I thought that the big society, although, you know, if you subscribe to ludicrous faux libertarian ideologies that essentially punt the interests of the super rich while pretending to represent taxpayers, then the big society could be seen as a bit of a con job. In other words, you're relying upon volunteers and altruism to knit a safety net that should actually be provided by the state, and therefore would involve taxing the wealthiest members of that state rather more than Conservatives are usually minded to. But I thought he was sincere. The hugger hoodie thing was a pithy little phrase designed to express the possibility that people on the fringes of society who were alienated, potentially criminalised and in danger of sinking further into dysfunction and disarray might benefit from a little bit of love, as opposed to, you know, the old mantra that I guess Priti Patel now represents a resurrection of, which is law and order and the sort of you need to be we need a lot more stick and a lot less carrot. And when he talked about lobbying, an area I'm fascinated by, because I think that if the average Brit knew the extent to which the media and political establishments have been completely and comprehensively infiltrated by people claiming to work for you, the taxpayer, or to be think tanks or whatever they're calling themselves this week, and yet who simply trouser epic sums of money from completely anonymous donors and then march into the heart of the establishment in order to defend the interests of the completely anonymous donors. I mean, it is genuinely breathtaking. It's, for me, the most significant element of British public or political life of the last 3 decades, bubbling away under the surface and infecting every corner of our unwritten constitution. So when he talked about lobbying being the next big scandal in, I think, about 2010, off the back of the expenses scandal, which my older listeners will remember, I believed him. I was not. What an idiot. Honestly. Great piece in the Mail on Sunday, 2 Sundays ago, by Dan Hodges, explaining that Boris Johnson will find it very hard to come down hard on David Cameron because he's very keen to do exactly what David Cameron has done when he stops being Prime Minister. In other words, fill their boots on a scale that the likes of you and I can only ever achieve by winning the National Lottery. Or no, actually, I'd go further. You'd have to win Euro Millions to pull off a payday on that sort of scale. So what did he do? Do you know what he did? Do you care what he did? That's what I mean about the tribal breakdown. Nick had a caller earlier which almost made me spit out my smoothie. He said he would forgive David Cameron absolutely anything because he had brought in the referendum, the Brexit referendum. You sort of think, crikey, I don't know how deeply buried your head has to be at the moment to think that that was a good idea or good for the country, but I can tell you someone who didn't think that it was good for the country, and that's David Cameron. But that kind of inability to see beyond the bonkers Brexit balm cake is, I think, in decline, isn't it? It seems to be diminishing. We haven't even mentioned Northern Ireland yet. But this is, I mean, this is staggering, you know. I'll run you through what he said last night, conveniently choosing a moment, a month into the scandal, conveniently choosing a moment, shortly after the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, guaranteeing that the news coverage, well, let's just say that if he'd spoken sooner, it would have got rather more coverage than it managed, although the newspapers didn't do a bad job at the weekend, and even the BBC stepped up to the plate on this one. What they need to do now is start holding the current Prime Minister to account, and we'll be golden. So what he's done is join the staff. He was an employee of a company called Greensill. There are all sorts of questions to be asked and hopefully answered about the role that the fellow who founded Greensill played when David Cameron was actually Prime Minister. But I want to look at the role that David Cameron played in the company after being Prime Minister. He joined the staff, which insulates him from lobbying regulation. You see, this is, again, I would call it morally wrong, but it wasn't legally wrong. So if I was a lobbyist, if I set up JOB lobbyists, jobbyists we could call it, there you go. If I set up a lobbying firm called Jobbying, and it was just me and Keith knocking it out of the back of a Reliant Robin, then if you hired me to do something for your business, I could get into bother, right? But if I was employed by your business, then I couldn't. That is the distinction. That's what's insulated him from sanction or from punishment. He hasn't done anything wrong because he was working for Greensill as an employee of Greensill. He was on the Greensill payroll. He wasn't working for David Cameron Lobbying Incorporated with a fat contract signed by Greensill. Now, I don't know enough about the sector or the industry to tell you whether or not that is as dodgy as it sounds at first glance, or whether actually that's a perfectly feasible and defensible way of doing business. You can't treat an in-house lobbyist in the same way that you would treat an outhouse lobbyist. Outhouse lobbyist has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? I think jobbyist the lobbyist is very much an outhouse lobbyist. So I don't know. If you do know a lot about the sector, then give us a call, seriously. But you've got to really have some feet in the story, in the sector. Should there be a difference between in-house lobbying and out-house lobbying? To my amateurish eyes, there shouldn't really be any difference at all, because the conflict of interest, the potential problems, the pratfalls are... the producer just pointed out David Cameron, of course, bought a £25,000 garden shed to work in, which is the very different definition of outhouse lobbying, isn't it? Well played. And so that's just an area where I need a little bit of help. I don't need any help with the morality of it, because it's actually incredible. So Greensill was not in great financial nick, it turns out, although whether he knew that or when he knew that is a question for the ages. And he basically started calling up senior cabinet ministers in the hope of doing business, in the hope of securing deals and contracts for this firm for which he was working. And it includes arranging a drink between the boss of the company, a guy called Lex Greensill. I don't know if the name Lex made everybody think of villains before Superman came along, but it does now, and I'm sure that's unfair. But he arranged for Lex Greensill to have a drink with Matt Hancock. We saw last week the text messages that he was sending to Rishi Sunak, and I want to know... I don't want you to defend it. I want you to tell me, is it defending it? I don't think it's defensible by any stretch of the imagination, but I suspect that people are going to be gloriously unsurprised by it. I don't know. I've got this naive, almost childlike belief that people in public life, once people achieve a certain sort of prominence, they're duty-bound to behave with more probity and morality than the rest of us. But the opposite usually seems to be true, doesn't it? So what he's done is use his status as a former Prime Minister to join the staff of a company, and then used his contacts book to try to get contracts for that company, that has now gone bust. And he reportedly told friends he was in line to make about 60 million quid if the company floated. I've seen that figure revised down to 20 million, and part of his statement, I think, involves that argument that he was not in line to make anything like as much money as some reports have said. But this is, this is actually breathtaking, isn't it? His defence is that he made the communications not just because I thought it would benefit the company, but because I sincerely believed there would be a material benefit for UK businesses at a challenging time. Really? He was trying to secure access to the government's loan scheme for Greensill, which later collapsed, putting thousands of UK steelmaking jobs at risk. The other element of the story that I think demands a double take is him hanging out in the desert with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. This is some 18 months after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. Literally in a tent on a camping trip with Lex Greensill and Mohammed bin Salman. I guess I'm trying to work out where naivety ends and fury begins. I do this for a living, right? I am conscious of how dodgy politicians, ex-politicians can be. The sense of entitlement that many of them possess. But I can't believe what I'm reading. I suppose that's the phone-in, isn't it? Am I just being naive? Of course they're all at this all the time, James. I can't believe you're such a silly little snowflake. Give me a call, 0345 60 60973. David Cameron, former Prime Minister, he signs up with this business and then starts trying to get them loans and contracts from cabinet ministers who have to kind of take his call and return it because he used to be their boss. It's just rotten, right? In Brexit Britain, do you think it'll touch the sides? 0345 60 60973. And the reason I suggested at the outset was that it might defy the tribal breakdowns that we're all suffering from is because he is, of course, someone that didn't want to leave the European Union. So the weird sort of furiously hard of thinking lobby that is currently in charge of the country, they're not supposed to like David Cameron. So maybe he will face proper scrutiny and proper sanction. I don't know. But we'll have a proper look at his statement and find out your thoughts on it. Am I going nuts, or is this really, really bad? I see it as an example of the Conservative Party and their client journalists following the Republican Party in America and Fox News down this path where reality is almost redefined. You know, we talk about post-truth, we talk about fake news, we talk about alternative facts. If you're a bit older than me, would this story have blown up in the previous generation on a scale that it's currently not blowing up, or am I being naive? 0345 60 60 973. 20 minutes after 11 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the idea, I just want you to respond to the idea that a former Prime Minister, and in this case it's David Cameron, can join the staff of a company and then start texting and calling cabinet ministers trying to secure very, very lucrative deals and or loans for that company, while reportedly telling friends that if everything goes according to plan, he could be in line for a £60 million payout. And feel free to have a swing at me on this, all right? Because I'm not a fan of Cameron. I thought austerity was awful and horrible and ideologically driven by this ludicrous small state, small government belief, which is great if you're rich, absolutely shocking if you're poor. But I didn't think he was a wrong 'un. I really didn't. I think that quitting after the referendum result was actually the right thing to do. As Theresa May discovered, there was no earthly way that the headbangers were going to let somebody from the other side try and minimise the damage that they'd caused while they were still denying that there was going to be any damage. But this, I just think this is rank. I think this is rancid. I think this is why people sometimes look at politicians in general, and perhaps Tory politicians in particular, and wonder whether things have changed at all since the sort of days of the rotten boroughs and the intrepid fox. 22 after 11 is the time. David's in Kilburn. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning. I can't help but be reminded, frankly, of the expenses scandal, which was not that long ago.
Yeah.
But bizarrely, the last time I think that the whole country, regardless of your political stripe, was actually united in disgust.
But I think we got that wrong. I don't want to relitigate that conversation because I was very much on my high horse about it at the time. But looking back, I think we may have got it slightly wrong in the context of that quiet agreement when you come into Parliament that this is what makes up for the fact that you don't get paid anything close to what many MPs might expect in the private sector. But we digress. So you think... well, I'm not seeing nationwide outrage about this yet, to be honest.
No, not at all. And actually, funnily enough, I can't imagine the Daily Telegraph of today being the ones who would have led a charge this way.
No, that's a good point.
10, 11 years ago. I mean, it dominated the news for 6 weeks. I mean, a political scandal lasting for 6 whole weeks.
We did, I think, probably...
something astonishing.
Until coronavirus, it was the last time we regularly did the entire 3-hour show on the same subject.
Yeah, well, there you go. But I think also it's almost a sense that the idea of rules being created by the very people who are actually in a position to break them, as opposed to independent bodies that can oversee them with any teeth, frankly, for those that get caught. I mean, not picking any particular battles, but the number of times you can look at something and say, for goodness sakes, man, didn't you realise this was the wrong thing to do, rather than mea culpa, you've caught me, oh, I'm sorry, and some weak-assed apology.
Crikey, your manner and your tone did not prepare me for your vocabulary at that point, David, but I don't think you crossed any lines or caused any offence. How much of it is business as usual? Because I despite doing this for a living, I do sometimes find myself feeling a little bit stupid when I look at stuff and see other people shrugging and going, duh, of course, and I go, no, seriously, I don't think this is normal, and I certainly don't think it should happen.
No, I'm not. Look, as much as there's plenty to be cynical about, I'm not, I think perhaps similarly to you, cynical in the sense that I genuinely believe a lot of politicians of all types genuinely get into the business for good service. Are those the ones that actually rise up to the position of being ministers who can actually be influential enough that they'd want to be targeted by lobbyists in the first place? I don't know. As opposed to sort of the grassroots backbenchers who care about their constituents and really, care more about what they can do rather than what can be done for them.
I mean, that's the fundamental question, really, isn't it, is how this story reaches breakfast tables and staff canteens, and I'm not sure it will. I don't know, but I'm not sure it will, because, I mean, partly, in a way, it's a kind of, well, I'd do that if I had the chance type of story. I'm not saying everybody would, but a lot of people perhaps would think, well, yeah, if I was in line for 60 million quid and all I had to do was arrange a lunch with Matt Hancock, I'd probably do it in a heartbeat. And you forget the questions of public probity and public service. And then the question of, I mean, it's going to come down to Boris Johnson to decide whether or not there is any form of inquiry. And
we've seen, frankly, that's incredibly unlikely to happen.
Exactly.
It'll either be kicked into the long grass, or, as we've seen with numerous things that have come out, it'll be, diluted down to the point of being, frankly, non-toxic.
Yeah, and yet there's something quite sad, and I use that word in its profoundest sense, about the idea of a former Prime Minister essentially just sort of shilling for big business and calling in all that's his commodity. That's what he is. He's for sale. And the price he was hoping to receive, tens of millions of pounds, in return for his contacts book. It can't be for his particular skill set, can he? Because he doesn't seem to have one. Thank you to Wayne in Basildon for getting in touch to tell me what jobby means in Scotland. I'm well aware of what jobby means in Scotland. That's why Jobbying, my new lobby company, is in an outhouse, Wayne. Do you get it? Out? Yeah? Good. And it's because David Cameron was in an outhouse lobbying, was not in an outhouse lobbying, but was in-house, that he's insulated from all of the rules. If I work for your company on the payroll, I can do what I want. I can lobby ministers as much as I please. If I work for my own lobbying company and you hire me on a contract, then there are all sorts of rules and regulations I'm required to obey and follow, which David Cameron didn't. Which, to me, on a moral question, looks very, very dodgy. John's in Sandy in Bedfordshire. John, what do you reckon?
Well, I tell you, James, I just feel like maybe today you've kind of gotten up on the naive side of the bed.
I think I do almost every day. But I prefer it that way.
Well, okay, if you prefer it that way. I mean, bluntly speaking, from my perspective, it's like I was surprised when I heard you say that you actually believed some of what Cameron said about certain policy ideas. Because, frankly, to me, nothing Cameron ever said, or his sidekick Osborne, was even remotely believable. To me, and I know we've had this discussion before, and I know you have lots of friends, the reality is I still think that Eaton's is Hogwarts of white-collar criminality.
You need to be careful, because no one's accusing David Cameron of criminality, and I mean, whatever colour his collar may be. I just wonder how. Well, like I say, I just wonder how it lands on breakfast tables. John, take care. 11:28 is the time. Mick's in Westminster. Mick, what would you like to say?
James, haven't spoken to you for a long, long time.
That's all right. Have you missed me?
I think I've missed everyone. I've been staying at home. Oh. David Cameron. As you know, I'm a black cab driver.
Yeah.
We've known about his...
Steady. Don't. I'm worried now. You're going to get me into trouble. You know the score. You know the rules of libel and the law and things like that.
No. Not going to get you in trouble.
Go on then.
This is a fact.
On your toes, Keith.
Right.
Go on.
David Cameron.
Yeah.
When he left the office of the Prime Minister, he then started working for a company called First Direct, which was the processing company that Uber used to...
Oh, fair play to you for bringing it back. I don't even know if that's true that he went to work for First Direct. And,
he did.
But you can't... So we're doing the... I've got no... I can't find any reference to that.
Okay, but you've only got to look at what Guy Adams did a big...
In the Mail.
In the Mail, about the democracy and all the scratch backing that was going on. It's just manifested itself.
So
again,
you're supremely unsurprised, and I'm not taking the mickey.
No.
You know that, mate.
No.
The Uber, the proximity of many members of that administration to very senior members of the Uber hierarchy was troubling, and as a black cab driver, you're going to be a lot more across the facts than I was. I'm not aware of him going to work for First Direct, but it doesn't really matter because I am aware of him going to work for Greensill, and he used his contacts to try to secure contracts, loans, I mean, basically cash for a company that subsequently went bust. Not least on the question of judgment. It means he's just not very good at spotting companies that would be good to join. 11:30 is the time. Holly Harris has the headlines. 25 minutes to 12 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I'm sort of struggling to convey my concerns about the Greensill story. I have the obvious concerns. I don't want to live in a country where our former prime ministers are for sale to the highest bidder, but I do. There's not a lot I can do about that. You look at someone like Gordon Brown and you know that there's not a check on the planet large enough for him to compromise his personal morality. Imagine that. And it was, of course, Brown that Cameron beat, albeit with Nick Clegg's help in 2010. Imagine Gordon Brown phoning up, I don't know, I can't remember anyone from that, because so long the Tories have been in power. Who was a sort of senior Labour... But Andy Burnham. Imagine Gordon Brown phoning up Andy Burnham if Labour had got into power in 2015, or Ed Miliband, and saying, I'm working... I won't do an accent because he's Scottish. I'm working for a massive bank, and I wonder if I could come in with the boss and have dinner with you, Andy, so that you could think about pushing some business art. Could you imagine Gordon Brown doing it? Now, you might be able to imagine Tony Blair doing that. I don't know whether that's fair or not, but you could not imagine Gordon Brown doing that. And yet here we are. So that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is this growing sense I have, and because I'm a stuck record, I fear that it's something that's been broken by Brexit. The utter detachment from observable reality, from evidence-based politics, from truth that was needed to get over the line. And then, tragically, instead of holding the liars and the cheats to account, we've ended up promoting them and putting them in power. I don't, and that's, how does Boris Johnson begin to address the problems in Northern Ireland, for example, until he admits, even implicitly, that he lied through his teeth about the Irish sea border? How can the man who lied to create the current situation be in charge of fixing or trying to fix the current situation? That's the mess we've made. But when it comes to this sort of dodgy dealing, I just don't know whether it's business as usual and you're supremely unsurprised by it, or whether it's evidence that even former prime ministers now are on the rank, cabs for hire. And the funniest thing I've ever read, that's not true by a long chalk, but Charles Moore, who's been ennobled by Boris Johnson, himself, of course, Charles Moore, a Barclay Brothers editor, he actually wrote an article about how there is such a thing as the wealth trap. I couldn't bring myself to read beyond the first couple of lines, and it was behind a paywall anyway. But he says you hear a lot about the poverty trap, but when you look at what David Cameron's been up to, you have to understand that sometimes you can get caught in the wealth trap, which is almost time to crack out Keith's tiny violin. Instead of that, Theo Usherwood is in the studio because Parliaments, plural, now are back a little early than originally planned and responding to the passing on Friday of the Duke of Edinburgh.
The House of Commons comes back at 2:30 this afternoon for a humble address, which is going to be led by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and more of that in a moment, because in Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament's already returned. Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, leading the tributes to the Duke of Edinburgh.
One of the Duke of Edinburgh's early engagements in Scotland, shortly after the Queen's coronation, was to plant a cherry tree in the grounds of Canongate Kirk, just across the road from here. It stands directly opposite the tree planted by the Queen a year previously. These trees are just about to bloom, as I'm sure they will do each spring for decades to come. I'm equally sure that, not just in the weeks ahead, but many years from now, people will think fondly of the Duke of Edinburgh as they pass Canongate Kirk and look across to Holyrood Palace. It is right that our Parliament pays tribute to him today. In doing so, we mourn his passing and we extend our deepest sympathy to Her Majesty the Queen and her family.
In the Welsh Assembly, in the Senedd, Mark Drayford, the Welsh First Minister, has also been paying tribute to Prince Philip.
We will all have heard the tributes of the last few days and their entirely accurate focus on the theme of public service. But it is worth pausing for a moment to remember the human story that goes alongside the service and the decade after decade in which that service was sustained.
As I said, the House of Commons is returning at 2:30. The Prime Minister leading that humble address. It reads that it's to be presented to the House of Commons to Her Majesty, by the House of Commons to Her Majesty, expressing the deepest sympathies of this House on the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the heartfelt thanks to this House and this nation for his unfailing dedication to this country and the Commonwealth, exemplified in his distinguished service in the Royal Navy in the Second World War. It goes on to say that he had a passionate commitment to the environment and his unstinting support to Your Majesty throughout his life. Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is expected to respond, and we're also expected to hear from the SNP leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford. The debate is scheduled to last until 10 p.m. tonight, James, although it will probably be much shorter.
Will it? So 10 p.m. is the time available, and what would it involve? I presume it will just be a warm and affectionate succession of personal tributes and possibly memories from MPs.
From exactly that, and of course many of those memories will be given over Zoom, virtually, screens but to the House of Commons, because of course not every MP has returned to the chamber, and that's also, should be said, in light of the fact that actually Parliament was due to come back tomorrow, but that of course has been brought forward so that this humble address can be given by the Prime Minister. MPs are expected on Zoom to be wearing formal attire, James, for this moment, and then of course there will be that minute's silence at the end of the week at the start of his funeral.
You are of course our political editor, so I should probably invite your thoughts on this David Cameron Greensill story. Where does it go next?
The question now, and this is what the talk is in Westminster, is whether the Cabinet Office is now starting to ask other special advisors to ministers, whether they had any contact with David Cameron or Lex Greensill, whether those two, David Cameron attempted to secure access to ministers, on whether they're special advisors who work on the behalf of ministers or ministers themselves, in order to provide access to those Whitehall departments for Mr. Greensill. And of course, there will be questions and pressure for Boris Johnson and Number 10 to implement a full inquiry into what has gone on here, to find out whether the government, in its own view, thinks that David Cameron has broken any rules. And of course, David Cameron in that statement insisting that he has not done so. James.
And the likelihood of an inquiry, pretty slim, I would imagine, given that it's in Boris Johnson's gift?
It is in Boris Johnson's gift. I mean, part of the issue at the moment, and this is, I'm not linking the two in any way, shape or form, but of course ministers aren't out on the airwaves, the opposition...
Until Saturday, until the funeral. People may not realise this. There's a sort of moratorium on all broadcast interviews
8 a.m.
and
on
press
Sunday.
conferences until 8 a.m. on Sunday.
8 a.m. on Sunday, that's the moratorium, and of course then that does allow time for ministers and of course opposition politicians from the Labour Party in particular, I'm thinking of here, to go on to the Sunday programmes, and if the story is still live and running, to try and put more impetus into it in calling for an inquiry. Whether Boris Johnson decides to go down that route remains in his gift and within the gift of Number 10.
Theo Ashwood, many thanks indeed. I hadn't realised that moratorium, because we don't generally interview politicians much on this programme, but it's going to present some challenges for other broadcasters.
Yes, but just I'm not linking the two. I'm just saying that's the situation we now find ourselves in.
I know you're not linking.
No, I know, but some people might listen to me explaining.
I could link the two. I could say, the timing's very convenient.
I'm not saying.
I know you're not. I wasn't suggesting for a minute you were. Just pointing out. I didn't know that. I kind of now you come to mention it. It explains a couple of the events of the last couple of days. It's coming up to 11:44. Let me squeeze in Andrew in Hay on this question of. I haven't quite got the question right yet. It's a sort of sense. What I want to know from you, Andrew, is whether or not this is, from where you sit, perfectly predictable and if not to be expected, then certainly not shocking. Because I think I'm shocked and I feel a bit silly.
I think you'd be disappointed. I don't think you can be surprised. If you look at his qualifications, there's no conceivable way that a guy like Cameron gets a high-ranking job in a private company. Based on his track record, it would take years and years and university degrees and qualifications.
Yes, I shouldn't laugh, but I mean it's the Rees-Mogg effect, really, isn't it? It's the idea that these people are born 3-0 up and they think they've scored a hat-trick through their personal skills and talents.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's the job for the boys. It's not the House of Lords, but 60 million quid's probably the next best thing he can get to. But
that's a disputed figure, but we're talking tens of millions of pounds if his share options, his shares had been realised. He gets diddly squat now, of course, because the whole company's gone bust.
Well, no fault of Dave's, I'm sure. He's an upstanding character, but you've only got to look. It's a mutually beneficial level of dodginess, isn't it? They've given him the job within that organisation because of the contacts he's got, not because of his qualifications.
And how does he process that? We're entirely speculative here, but I find that fascinating, because I laugh about the Jacob Rees-Mogg effect. Jacob Rees-Mogg obviously thinks he's very clever and talented. It doesn't cross his mind that if he hadn't been born with a silver spoon up his fundament, then he'd probably be, I don't know, on trolley duty at Sainsbury's. But not that there's anything wrong with being on trolley duty at Sainsbury's. But do you think David Cameron... we'll never know, but I find it psychologically fascinating. Does he go to bed at night thinking, that Greensill are very lucky to have me because of my skills? Or does he realise that he's essentially selling to the highest bidder or to a very high bidder the trappings of the Prime Minister's office?
I think to be in a position where you're Prime Minister at any stage of life, you've got to have a certain level of ego where you think you are the only person that can run the country effectively. So I think it's sort of ingrained in the DNA of certain people. I'd throw Rees-Mogg in there as well.
And it's why John in Sandy referenced the Etonian education, which is a bit glib, a bit obvious, but it is about people being taught that they really are born to rule. I mean, they literally are born to rule.
Yeah, but that's why he got the contract he got. He didn't get one as the paid advisor, whatever the conflict is. He got given that specific job role with those specific contractual obligations, so he could use his influence with government and contacts that he still had within the government. Otherwise, he would have been quite clearly breaking the law. So.
Or breaking the rules. I don't know if it's the law. I think it's more a code of conduct for former ministers. And the idea that I gave an award during lockdown. It was a very muted and poignant ceremony, actually, because everything was done over Zoom. I was in a little studio in central London speaking to people around the world, giving awards for services to human rights, including the girlfriend of the late journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who American intelligence has concluded was killed in an operation likely to have been approved by Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Fast forward just over a year, and David Cameron's in a tent with him, and this Lex Greensill dude in the middle of the Saudi desert. Oh, how? I don't. Well, yeah, like the other fella said, maybe I got out on the naive side of bed. Here it is. 11:52 is the time from the sort of House Journal of. Well, it used to be the Conservative Party, but now clearly it is just a sort of Boris Johnson fanzine. But this is the article I was talking about. I don't know whether we pay to go behind the paywall in the studio, but it's here. I just wanted to get the first line right. This is Charles Moore, now Lord Moore, of course. I think you often hear of people being trapped in poverty. But it is also possible to be trapped in wealth. Keith, get your violin. I mean, I understand the point he's making, but I can't believe he's making it in public. This is David Cameron's fate. He is not a financially greedy man or stinking rich, but he comes from a background in which hereditary wealth is the norm. His wife Samantha even more so. He does not think such wealth is wrong. If he did, he would have an easy remedy, get rid of it, but he finds it embarrassing. He also knows that it can make him politically vulnerable. Once he began, years ago, to play along with the essentially left-wing idea that private money is suspect and that tax planning and legal avoidance are immoral, he was trapped. Now, everything he has done in this area is made to look dodgy, yet it is little different from saving in a tax-free ISA or even buying duty-free drink. I mean, that in a way is the point I've been trying to make to you, which is you'll be told to look away, and much as I love you, I'm going to have to stop saying I love you like a brother, by the way, because that murderer on the Channel 5 drama nicked my catchphrase last week, and I can't say it now with a straight face without remembering him. I hope that I haven't just issued a spoiler on that programme, but it's over now, so if you missed it, you missed it. I think you're going to look away. And I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because you don't care, or whether it's because he's a Tory, or whether it's because he's a member of the ruling class and we're not supposed to question them, or whether it's because you're bored, or whether it's because of Brexit. I just don't... And here is someone telling you, someone who is now a Conservative Lord, telling you to look away. Nothing to see here at all. A former Prime Minister joined the staff of a finance company from which he was set to make tens of millions of pounds in personal profit and set about trying to secure contracts and loans for that company by texting and calling up his old mates in the cabinet. Oh, man. I just think that's so wrong. And I got this horrible little voice in my head saying, oh, get over yourself, mate. 'Twas ever thus. Was it really? Or are we living in a dirtier political age than any that you can remember? 0345 6060 973. Dave's in Liverpool. Dave, what do you reckon?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Oh.
Sadly, I think this is just the tip of a very large iceberg. And I just think that, generally the Conservatives are getting braver and braver and getting away with
bold. Let's go for bold. Soldiers and firefighters are brave.
Yeah, sorry.
Bold is that? Yeah. You know what I mean, though, don't you?
Yes, definitely. Bolder.
Emboldened, much shameless. Shameless is what you mean.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You've hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
Got there in the end.
And the fact is, there's nobody to hold them to account. where are the opposition parties jumping from the roofs about this?
Well, they can't this week, to be fair, because of the moratorium after the Duke of Edinburgh's death. It'll be interesting to see what Keir Starmer does with this story. But, of course, don't forget Cameron. I know you haven't forgotten. I'm just pointing out he's not actually in charge. And if Starmer's not landing enough punches on the current Old Etonian Prime Minister, the chances of him landing any on the last one are pretty slim.
Yeah, sadly. And, I think people are getting apathetic and, these people in these positions of power, they continue to feather their own beds and
I know exactly, and it took you saying it for the penny to drop in my mind while you were speaking. I know exactly why I'm so worried about this story, so perturbed by it. I think this is... It could be a step, and I think this tallies with what you've just said. This is how the really bad stuff happens, when we turn off and we look away and we stop caring. So sometimes it's really out there and deliberate, like Trump literally telling people to start ignoring the evidence of their eyes and ears and just believe whatever he tells them. But sometimes it's more incremental than that, more insidious, less blatant. And this is just... So now you have someone who's been made a peer by the current... An Old Etonian who's been made a peer by another Old Etonian telling you not to worry about the third Old Etonian who's perceived as doing something dodgy, but actually it's perfectly fine, and the only people who have a problem with it are the people who've got a problem with inherited wealth. That to me speaks of baby steps on a path to some really dark places for a country.
Definitely. And this government had the cheek to send inspectors up to Liverpool Council... can Liverpool Council send inspectors into what's going on with the government, with all their PPE contracts and things like that?
I'm sensing that you don't have much sympathy for people who are trapped in wealth, Dave. Can I call you Dave?
Not a lot, no. Surprisingly, not a lot.
No, trapped in wealth. Does anyone want to have a crack? That'd be a great phone-in. Does anyone want to have a crack at explaining to Dave and I what being trapped in wealth really feels like? I know what it means, because I have an element of it in my own personal life. It's when you are... and I wasn't born into anything like wealth, quite the opposite. But through schooling and social life and university, I've got friends who were. And when you're with people who are... I mean, imagine this. It's a great-looking book, I haven't read it yet, by Musa Okwonga, who went to Eton oddly, and as well, I say oddly, it's not odd at all, but it's odd that it's all planets aligning on this, because it was only this weekend, oddly, that the book was released, and he wouldn't have known that the Cameron story was going to gather pace this month. But I can't quite imagine what it would have been like to grow up never worrying about basic financial security. I don't mean worrying about whether or not you can be able to buy a big house in the country, or worrying about how many cars you're going to be able to drive, or whether or not you're going to be able to send your children to private school. I mean worrying about the most basic premise of financial security. And remember, I'm well off, I'm privileged. I went to posh school and all of that malarkey, but when I was in my early to mid-20s, I was conscious of the fact that that it was perfectly possible that my ship wouldn't come in, right? And I'd carry on working in a shop, which I enjoyed, and I would never achieve anything like the career success that my dad had achieved. And if that happened, then I'd have nothing. I wouldn't have an inheritance or a big house. Do you see what I mean? And that's the bit that I think you either get or you don't get. That's the wealth trap. It's this idea that you move in a world where survival is never an issue. Even success is never an issue. Security is never an issue. So what is? What do you measure yourself against? And people like David Cameron measure themselves against, people like his father-in-law, who inherited a castle and a title and all the trappings that go with it. I think that's what Charles Moore is talking about, but I'm not entirely sure. One thing I do know is that there's not a violin small enough to play a mournful dirge in sympathy with people trapped in the wealth trap, trapped in wealth. Do me a favour. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on at LBC. The quote, or rather the sort of statement, is it's a work of art, actually. It really is. I have reflected on this at length, said David Cameron. There are important lessons to be learned. As a former Prime Minister, I accept that communications with government need to be done through only the most formal of channels, so there can be no room for misinterpretation. Misinterpretation? What are you talking about, misinterpretation? There is no misinterpretation. You called up cabinet ministers and tried to get them to push some business or some loans in the direction of a company that you were on the payroll for and in line for tens of millions of pounds in profit if you cashed in your shares. I've worked out my own personal problem. No, not that one. Just my personal problem with this particular story. In that I worry that this is symptomatic of a much broader malaise, and I want you to reassure me that it isn't. But you can't. Can you? 0345 6060973. And that's why I'm saying things like, give me a call, tell me that it's not a big deal. I'm not softening you up for a scrap. I'm doing the polar opposite. I'll tell you, the two books that have really worried me. You met the authors of one of them, Jonathan Calvert and George Arbuthnot, who Failures of State, who've done an astonishing forensic analysis of the last year of mismanagement and worse undertaken by this government. But the one that really scares me, I haven't got stuck into properly yet, but it's by a journalist called Peter Oborne, who you might be familiar with. And he is ploughing a very lonely furrow at the moment as a former luminary of the conservative media. He now talks about his former stamping grounds in ways that listeners to this programme will be familiar with from me. And I worked and knew Peter many, many moons ago, and I still bump into him occasionally. But for someone like, if you like, a gamekeeper termed poacher, that really, really worries me. It's the flesh-coloured body stocking defence again. I derive enormous comfort from thinking that the Emperor might not be naked. He might have a flesh-coloured body stocking on. But then when you look at who's standing next to you in the crowd shouting, no, he's naked too, and in the case of the Failures of State book, Jonathan and George are Sunday Times journalists, and then in case of Oborne's ex-Telegraph, ex-Mail, ex-Spectator. He's worked in all of the sort of highest profile right-wing media outlets, and they're seeing something, particularly Peter, they're seeing something similar to what I think I'm seeing. And that's when I get really worried. And that's why I want you to ring me and tell me nothing wrong at all, James, with a former Prime Minister seeking to trouser tens of millions of pounds by essentially peddling access to government ministers. I don't know. 7 minutes after 12, we got an Idiot of the Day award, someone I think with a straight face, it's hard to be sure, you could be joking, claiming this is exactly what Hunter Biden did with that company in the Ukraine that he worked for. Well, two things, mate. Hunter Biden has certainly never been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he's never held political office in America either. So if a company was paying him because of his surname, then, yeah. Oh, boy, I don't know why I bother sometimes. Steve's in Southwark. Steve, what would you like to say?
Yeah, James, what we mustn't forget here is that Cameron has fallen for this. I mean, you had a cab driver on earlier who mentioned it.
Yes.
But let's just remind everybody what went on. Rachel Whetstone was the head of Uber's marketing and PR.
Married to...
Steve Hilton, the sock guru, David Cameron's special advisor.
And now someone who it veers to the right of Fox News contributors and presenters, of which he is one.
Yeah, but what needs to be remembered is when the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson,
rings a bell.
Wanted to bring... Yeah, the blonde guy, you might have seen him on the TV. When he wanted to bring in extra controls in London on safety concerns for the private hiring...
This is true. This is a matter of record. Mick, I think, got First Direct mixed up with a different company, so it put me on my uppers slightly.
This is all... Well,
but this is... No, this... I remember this. This is bang on the record. Carry on.
And what happened? Osborne and Cameron, it was Cameron and Osborne, texted and called Boris Johnson. Boris has admitted it, basically saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? So we've got the two highest offices of the land, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, lobbying for then tax-dodging $70 billion American company, lobbying the Mayor of London.
Tax avoiding, maybe, not dodging necessarily. They have to be double careful.
They're taking advantage of the tax situation. And it's quite incredible that nothing was done then. They were in office at the time. Never mind now, he held office.
Yeah. I've got the quote here. There were conversations, mainly in text messages from Dave and George, making arguments about free markets and competition. And this meant that 3 months after drawing up proposals that would have helped are you a driver yourself, Steve? I'm going out on a limb and guessing that you might be.
Yes, I'm something to do with the black cab industry, as you probably sussed, but it wasn't about us.
No, I know. I'm not having a go. I'm just saying that the plans were there on the table that would have actually given you more of a fighting chance against the growing number of private hire cars using Uber. This is going back to the dog end of 2015. 3 months later, he dropped several of the most controversial ideas and subsequently revealed that this happened after conversations with Dave and George. And, of course, the entire administration, as you've just reminded us, was extremely close to Uber.
Osborne and Cameron went to their Christmas party, Uber's Christmas party, about 3 weeks later. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. But in his defence, in Cameron's defence, this sense of entitlement, you've got to remember that where he went to school, and me and him went to different schools together, he had all his friends, all his colleagues, everybody that he grew up with, that was involved with, went to university with, have all gone into the city and other very well-paid jobs, as you know, and they've all made their money.
Not all of them.
Well, an awful lot of them will have done.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fellow I was just talking about who's written a book, he's younger than Cameron, but he contains within his book tales of not being particularly well off, but it's more, you're talking about the circles that he mixes in are minted, to put it briefly.
They are, and he now feels that having done his bit for public service, that he's now entitled to catch up with the others as quickly as he can.
But this is the wealth trap.
Indeed it is, and it must be an awful situation to be in, and I only wish I was in it with them.
Do you know, you've got a great gift. For a while there, I thought you were being serious.
Yeah, well, perhaps not.
No, well, I know, but in a way, and don't laugh at me, you know what they say, the happiest man is the man who lives on the most expensive house in his street. It doesn't matter what street you live in.
Yes.
And I understand that. And happiest is probably a silly way of putting it, but that sense of fulfilment comes from comparison, doesn't it? Contentment comes from comparison. It shouldn't, and one of the great benefits of therapy is that increasingly it doesn't, I discover. But it's a human condition that we all recognise. So if Cameron's knocking out with his wife's brother's the heir to a title and a castle. Cummings is father-in-law as well. I mean, everywhere you turn in these corridors, in these corners, there are people who've got real heft, hereditary heft, which he doesn't have, and we are both cautiously suggesting that may have prompted him to take his eye off the ball when it comes to objective morality.
You've put it a lot more succinctly than I could have done, James, but I think you've just about hit the nail on the head. And, of course, equally, his partner in crime, Osborne, when he went on to be editor of The Standard, also took a job at BlackRock.
Yes.
The investment house.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
£600,000 a year.
Yeah.
Rumours have it from the staff there that he was never seen there. And, of course, we mustn't forget that BlackRock is a major investor in Uber.
So all roads lead to Uber, Steve. And I'm saying that with a straight face, albeit a smile, because it was an early indication. Why do you think I got on my high horse about it so often? It wasn't just for the free rides I get off people like Steve when they're kind enough to clock who I am in the back of the car. It was genuinely a worry that you were seeing something break. And that's pre-Brexit, which leads us back to my other question about whether we're looking at something unprecedented here, something new, something significant. I thought, and I might do this, I might write them down one day, that what I would call the milestone moments during our time together, all the years that I've been doing this, and however many of them you've been listening. My faith in human nature was shaken by the response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, long before Jacob Rees-Mogg accused dead children of lacking common sense. My faith in human nature was shaken by the way that people in this country responded to it, by drawing upon the ethnicity of the victims or making claims about refugee status and similar. And I just felt, as someone raised in the Christian faith, I just felt that something broke for me that day in the context of faith in human nature. The Uber story broke my sense of British fair play. I know it was endorsed by a judge, the idea that pressing a button on your phone is somehow different from sticking your hand in the air, but it felt to me like a breach of good faith. The firefighters' industrial dispute, when friends and colleagues from Fleet Street started turning their fire on firefighters who were audacious enough to ask that the contracts they'd signed at the beginning of their careers be respected and reflected until the end of their career. All of these moments, and Uber was one of them. I wonder whether this is another. And they're linked. Steve links them. He ties them together quite rightly and quite adroitly. A former Prime Minister flogs access to government ministers. Is there another way of putting this? In the hope of a multi-million pound payday from a company that actually was teetering upon the brink of the bankruptcy it's now suffered. I don't know. I guess you can't ring me and reassure me that things aren't as bad as they look. Maybe you can tell me why people don't care enough. 12:18 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The jungle drums are beating, and the tune tells us that the government is expected to launch some sort of independent inquiry into what David Cameron has been up to, which leads me back to the tribal observation I made an hour ago, where it could break down as leave remain. Would Boris Johnson throw his old school chum under a bus, regardless of what was written on the side? Well, I mean, show me an example of Boris Johnson behaving in an honest and an open fashion, and I'll call you a liar. So I just don't know, really. And what if they do an independent report in it, and then the independent report comes back and Boris Johnson chooses either to completely ignore it and chuck it in the bin, as he did with the report into Priti Patel's bullying, prompting the independent as the key word, advisor on the ministerial code to resign in protest? Or would it go the way of this race report that was pretty much written to delight racists, and did? Oh, the racists were queuing up to tell you how great that report was. I don't know whether you noticed. You could almost have predicted who would file, copy or make public pronouncements about how this was an absolute vindication of all the racism that we've quietly excused and indeed indulged in over the last 20 years. Reported at the weekend that the Downing Street intervened to rewrite that independent report. So by all means have an independent report into David Cameron, but remember that Downing Street reserves the right either to rewrite it or to completely ignore it, or possibly both. Although that would be a waste of energy. What's the point of rewriting something and then completely ignoring it? You either completely ignore it, Priti Patel, or you rewrite it, racism. You're still with me at the back? And by the way, you live here, and so do I. Karen's in Surbiton. Karen, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, I'll try and be brief.
Why?
You said, is
Why?
This new?
I never do.
No, you said, is this new? And I would say to you, well, it's relatively new. Not since, like, the 17th, 18th century have we seen such naked, self-interested greed.
Gosh.
My background is as a solicitor in the public sector. I've worked for the magistrates course, the clerk, advising magistrates on cases and personal standards.
Right.
I've also been the chair of governors. Now, I think the current incumbents in power, and I make this as a cross-party thing, let's ignore party and look at who's actually wielding the power and what they're doing for themselves. And I think they just realised that the standards we have and the systems for enforcement are completely toothless. So in the past, if anything
they rely on honour and trust to a point, don't they?
That's exactly right. They rely on integrity. And if anything happened in the past that suggested a breach, people would A, stand down, B, if it went to some kind of inquiry, that would definitely require a stand down. And there were tests like, were there a conflict of interest? Was there a pecuniary conflict of interest? And the test, what would the man on the Clapham omnibus think about this? I call that the would you buy a used car from this person test.
Yes.
And I think we all know what's going on there. So things like the putting contracts out to tender, the bullying, both systems, both obvious breaches that have gone through a system and been found very sadly lacking in behaviour or just conduct in public life.
I mean, you mentioned the bullying.
Absolutely nothing.
No, nothing
There's
at all.
no
But it's worse than that, because I mean the independent advisor on the ministerial code resigning in protest at Johnson refusing to act on Priti Patel's bullying. That came after, of course, she got fired as International Development Secretary for lying to Theresa May. I mean, where? This is a recurring theme on the programme, and I somehow missed the way that the Cameron story slots into it, because I don't see him as part of the current regime, but you see his conduct as a consequence of the amorality of the current regime.
Yeah. I think they have institutionalised the gravy train, and to do that, as I say, I referred to the fact that I've been a chair of governors of a state school.
Yeah.
All of which is voluntary. The whole academy system has allowed employment of friends, family, lucrative contracts going out to friends and family, and I mean hundreds of thousands of pounds. Heads pay going beyond anything we could possibly imagine for these senior head teachers of groups of schools calling themselves companies, giving lucrative contracts to their other halves and employing unqualified staff. I lead on very briefly to the building industry, which is a massive gravy train. Help to buy. The only thing that's done is help to line the pockets of builders and developers. The poor saps who've done Help to Buy find themselves largely in clad buildings up the creek without a paddle, no exit, and the only people who are making money because Help to Buy inflates the price artificially of the property are the builders. And we can't even trust the building regulations anymore behind the scenes. You know, we used to be able to rely on these things tooth and nail. And I could go into my council experience locally, but that wouldn't be fair on the current incumbents. But the last lot, Jesus, I've just completely... And when I've raised things at local meetings, because I'm quite incensed, I've got past it now, but incensed. And then the next question from a local resident, you said, why don't people do something? So I've raised the fact that, for example, the last Conservative administration, and it's Kingston Council, we had a newly elected councillor who showed...
Steady. Remember, I'm not fully across these facts. You're a solicitor. Flipping out. I don't need to give you lessons in the law, I hope.
This is why I'm going to say this is public record.
Okay.
So we had somebody with no background of being a councillor who got himself elected to the council and within about 3 seconds became head of licensing in the centre of town.
Right.
Now, he had an independent licensing consultancy, and that was something I followed up with.
Okay, put a date on it then. When did? Sorry, I'm interrupting you. You did promise to be brief. I thought
about 10 years ago.
Okay, so put not a date on that particular story. A date in your experience of where it felt as if we'd gone over the hump, as it were, as if.
I would 10 years. 10 years.
You'd say 10. So roughly when David Cameron became prime minister. Roughly when David Cameron became prime minister, and you know, I obsess a little bit about the ludicrous collection of ghouls and vampires who masquerade as think tankers and similar. But of course, their entire credo, their entire raison d'etre, is to represent the interests of very wealthy people who love nothing more than the idea of getting their hands on public money, while simultaneously punting the idea that governments spend too much. It's weird, isn't it? So governments spend too much unless they're spending it on projects run by people like Lex Greensill. I don't know, it's just a thought. Karen mentions 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So this is quite interesting. Here's Gordon Brown this morning.
Ministers must never be lobbying, former ministers, prime ministers must never be lobbying for commercial purposes. Current ministers should not be entertaining such lobbying. And if we can't succeed in achieving this, stopping by the sort of flexibility of the rules, we're going to have to pass laws to make sure that at least for, say, 5 years, no serving or former prime minister or minister is ever lobbying for any commercial purpose within government.
I love it when that happens, because Gordon Brown essentially just endorsed Karen's point. Because why would you need laws? Because we can't rely upon the current system, which is built upon trust and honour, in a way. I know he didn't exactly say that, but I think you'd struggle to argue that wasn't the subtext. So that was Gordon Brown this morning. See if you recognise this fella from about 10 years ago.
Sure that ex-ministers are not allowed to use the contacts and knowledge gained in government for their own private gain. We'll double the time when it's forbidden for ex-ministers to lobby government from 12 months to 2 years. We'll extend to 10 years the period during which ex-ministers must seek advice from the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. We will put that committee on a statutory basis, so ignoring its advice will be an offence. Clearly, the first task of an incoming government will be to instruct the Prime Minister's advisor on the ministerial code to undertake a full review of this particular episode so the government can learn the lessons of what has gone wrong and change any other rules necessary to make sure it doesn't happen again.
That was David Cameron. I don't know if you could make out what he was saying through the howls of pain caused by being caught in the wealth trap. That was David Cameron essentially promising to outlaw what David Cameron has spent the last year doing. That's incredible. I may play that again. I'm not lost for words, you'll be pleased to hear, because I'm here till 1. But that is David Cameron describing his intention to outlaw what David Cameron has spent the last year doing. Well, you tell me if I've got that wrong. Listen again, listen more closely this time, and then tell me whether or not whether you have any quibble at all with the contention that here is David Cameron, was he in campaign mode or had he already won the election? I think it's from 2010, this speech. But either way, here is David Cameron promising 11 years ago to outlaw exactly the kind of conduct that David Cameron has been indulging in for the last 12 months. That's my suggestion to you. You tell me if you hear anything different.
Sure that ex-ministers are not allowed to use the contacts and knowledge gained in government for their own private gain. We'll double the time when it's forbidden for ex-ministers to lobby government from 12 months to 2 years. We'll extend to 10 years the period during which ex-ministers must seek advice from the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. We will put that committee on a statutory basis, so ignoring its advice will be an offence. Clearly, the first task of an incoming government will be to instruct the Prime Minister's advisor on the ministerial code to undertake a full review of this particular episode so the government can learn the lessons of what has gone wrong and change any other rules necessary to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And I'd remind you that the ministerial advisor on the code is currently non-existent because they haven't replaced the one who resigned over Boris Johnson's refusal to implement or to respect the findings with regards to Priti Patel bullying. So, OK, this is one of those days. I didn't realise, actually. This is one of those days where the planets align. It's all, as Karen suggested, it's all tied together. That's incredible, right? Where is, and there's a question I've been asking you for a long time now, where is accountability in this country? Where has it gone? Where has it gone? Would you have a look down the back of the sofa? 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. I mean, because you look at Trump. Trump is so barefaced. I know what you're thinking. No, he's not, James. He's orange-faced. But Trump is so blatant in his corruption and his depravity that you sort of look at the British equivalent and you think, oh, it's never going to be that bad. It's never going to. But that is David Cameron literally describing the need to outlaw, even criminalise, conduct that he has been indulging in for the last year. And this is again what I mean when I say to you, give me a ring and tell me that it's not like it looks. I'm not actually softening you up for a scrap and hoping to lock antlers with you. I'm really hoping you can tell me that I'm not living in a country as corrupt as it currently appears to be. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 12:34 is the time, and I just put up a clip of me talking about David Cameron, and I've realised who my hair currently reminds me of. It's the Wetherspoons bloke. Oh, my days. This has got to stop soon. Seriously, I can't carry on like this. I've been texting my hairdresser all morning. Sorry, barber, bloke, yeah. Oh, dear. I had to toss up between booking a table in the pub or going for a late haircut. I'm afraid I chose pub. But looking at that picture, I do, don't I? I look a bit like the Wetherspoons. Oh, man, that's terrible. Anyway, we digress slightly because here it is. And this is... I mean, this is actually staggering. Here's a question you can't answer. It's not a radio phoning question. Please prove me wrong. Ring in and answer it. I'd love you to, but I don't think you can. The last two independent inquiries that Boris Johnson has presided over, I think it's the last two. I may have got my numbers slightly wrong. So let's take two. That so-called race report, which is being disowned at a rate of knots by people who were quoted in it, but is being praised to the rafters by racists who had nothing to do with it. Unbelievable. And the inquiry into whether or not Priti Patel had bullied staff. One got rewritten by Downing Street so it would fit better into what they wanted it to say rather than what it did actually say. And one got chucked in the bin, prompting the resignation of the independent advisor on the ministerial code. So the question I'd like you to answer, what the hell is the point of them announcing an independent inquiry into David Cameron's lobbying on behalf of Greensill? The last two independent inquiries have either been chucked in the bin and completely ignored, because I'm afraid Priti Patel breaking the ministerial code is dog bites man territory, not man bites dog. She breaks the ministerial code like most of us break quick. Think of something easy to say that we all break a lot. Thank you, Keith. She breaks the ministerial code as easily as most of us break wind. Keith, that is one of my favourite moments in all our time together. And I wish you could see the pictures in the studio, because he's having his lunch at the moment. And as I said those words, I saw it, he thought, oh, I've got one. So he swallowed down a mouthful of grub at a slightly quick pace. I hope he hasn't done himself a mischief or got a dose of the hiccups, and then just leant forward and whispered into my ear, wind, and then carried on chewing his dinner. It was a moment of absolute radio beauty. Thank you, Keith. But he's right, isn't it? She breaks the ministerial code as freely as most of us break wind. And here we are, looking at an independent inquiry into what David Cameron has done. Why? Why? What's the point? If they don't like what's in it, they'll rewrite it or chuck it in the bin. I'm hearing it's just been confirmed. They must be listening. It's just been confirmed that there is going to be, or Sky is reporting, that it has been confirmed that there will be an independent inquiry into what David Cameron has been up to. Which, look at Boris Johnson. I'll tell you what's going on. Yeah, this won't touch me, will it, folks? Cogito ergo sum. Absolutely no danger whatsoever of any of this coming back. It's not my fault what David Cameron's been up to. And if Matty Old Hancock and Rishi Dishi Sunak were stupid enough to take his calls and reply to his text messages, well, that's their lookout. It's going to make Rishi Sunak look bad. He's currently my biggest rival for leadership at any potential potholes on the path ahead. It's going to make Matt Hancock look bad, who's come out of the coronavirus crisis arguably better than anyone was expecting. It's not going to make me look bad. I had nothing to do with it. I was mayor of blinking London when he was Prime Minister. I couldn't even get a job in his cabinet. So Boris Johnson has called an independent inquiry into David Cameron. Of course, in the unlikely event of that report containing anything that Boris Johnson doesn't like, he can either chuck it in the bin like he did with the Priti Patel one, or rewrite it like he did with the racism one. And still we live here. Bob's in Brighton. Bob, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
before I get on my soapbox, could I just say, you've had me on a couple of times now. It's a real privilege. And you and Sheila and Eddie have made working from my house for the last year much more bearable. Thank you.
That is a lovely thing to say. And certainly in the context of Eddie and Sheila, I can completely see the wisdom of your description. I'm grateful for the kind words, Bob. What do you want to say?
I wasn't trying to butt you up, mate. Thank you.
I know you weren't. That's why I responded sincerely.
I thank you. It was meant sincerely.
Yes.
I'd just like to chuck something in, and you might think it's overreaching. You might think it's a fair look, but I'd like to compare what we're seeing. This very tight-knit group of people being able to exert influence and power and change through things like letters, emails, text messages. David Cameron used to sell dinners to donors for different
Well, they
amounts.
all do that. I mean, that's not confined to Tories. It just, I guess, that you're less likely to get the wife of a Russian plutocrat paying a couple of $100,000 to play tennis with Margaret Beckett than you are with Boris Johnson, I suppose.
Yes.
But it's not confined to any one party trying to raise funds.
You're absolutely right. I just first read about it in Private Eye when it was David Cameron, and they had the price list of the different levels of exposure you could get. I'd just like to compare that, because that is how the powerful get effect change. And I'd just like to compare that to the legislation we've seen in the last few weeks that outlaws various types of protest and annoyance. Because I think this is a world-class issue, and I think those that are in power perpetuate their power through their influence, their very close influence, without scrutiny.
So to paraphrase, we're looking at a period perhaps of unprecedented political corruption and malfeasance, and the politicians responsible for it are reducing and diminishing our capacity to protest against it.
Yes.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. Cheers, Bob. That's cheered me right up.
Well, I'm sorry. It is. I don't know. What am I trying to say?
I just told you what you're trying to say. Keep up, man, will you?
yeah. Sorry, you're right. It is. And the thing is, I think it doesn't have to be the corruption doesn't have to be getting any worse, because this has always been there. This is how some of these systematic processes and institutions work, is by this influence, this old boys network, etc. But it doesn't have to be getting any worse. It's supposed to be getting better. That's what that Cameron clip is about.
That's incredible, wasn't it?
Like, we've recognised it. We recognised it a decade ago. We recognised it before that. We're supposed to be...
But I think he was telling the truth, wasn't he, back then? Or was he just saying what he thought he had to say in order to get elected? And don't call me naive. I've already done it enough myself.
No, I think he was saying what he had to say in that role at that time. But he's in a different role now. I don't believe there's any greater... another one of your callers, I think it was you, Michelle, so sorry, made a really good point earlier in the week about... Prime Ministers are much younger now than they ever were before, and so they have to have a role and a purpose after they leave office. But I think we should put them into the House of Lords, legislate them into the House of Lords, and then at least we can give them the scrutiny they need.
Well, yeah, I mean, even though... Blair has struck up some deeply questionable associations with political leaders, with regimes, and with politicians, which I can't think of a precedent for that. Thatcher just sort of toddled about a bit, didn't she? Brown seems to have committed himself to good works in post-politics life, just as he did in politics life, and quite probably pre-politics life. Cameron, it just seems to have swapped the Prime Ministership for a skip full of scratch cards and spent the ensuing 5 years rubbing the silver splodges off all of them and hoping that one of them will come up trumps. And when that didn't work, he sort of called up Matt Hancock and Rishi Sunak and at least 2 other ministers to ask for help in buying more scratch cards, because he desperately needs that multi-million-pound payout that comes if the company gets floated, if he cashes in his shares. Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the kind words as well. I know that Sheila and Eddie will also appreciate. Paul is in Shefford in Bedfordshire. Paul, what's going on?
Well, I think it's a failure of the media to hold these people to account.
Yeah, present company accepted.
Yeah, but we've got the case where the main political correspondents for the BBC and ITV, I think they're frightened to hold the government ministers to account because they'll lose access to their Downing Street sources.
But that was always the case, wasn't it? I mean, I
don't think it was. I think it. In 10 plus years ago, Tory and Labour governments alike, they knew the press were there to hold them to account.
Alistair Campbell?
Yeah, he spun very well, didn't he?
Well, that's what you're talking. I mean, Alistair Campbell was I don't know if he was I was going to say an iron fist in a velvet glove. I think he was an iron fist in an iron glove. So the idea that things have got worse.
No, I'm not talking about spin or anything like that. That's always gone on. What I'm saying is that these correspondents will lose their access to Downing Street sources. It will just be turned off.
And I guess the proof of the pudding is in the Piers Morgan, isn't it? And the way that programme was completely deprived of guests, cabinet-level guests, because he was perceived as giving them a kicking.
Yeah, and when was the last time you saw a minister on Channel 4 News?
I don't know.
Exactly. Most of their reports always end up with, we invited a government minister, but they declined to be interviewed.
Well, do you know, don't laugh at me, because I'm going to make a bit of a fool of myself now. I think I wrote about this in my... Again, it's a daily basis, mate. I think I wrote about this in my first book. I think I may have even made this point. I'm not suggesting you've nicked it off me, because it's clear and present, isn't it? And so what do you do? So for me, it was Brexit-based, as so much of my... madder moments are. For me, it was like, you don't get someone like Digby Pudding-Jones on your programme to talk about X until you ask him how the hell he could have been so completely wrong about Y. And he's not really a politician anymore, despite having a seat in the House of Lords. So what would you do if you were political editor of the BBC and you knew that if you went after Priti Patel with the evidence and the honesty that, for example, I do, then you'd never get a cabinet minister on the show again, or you'd never get a call from one of your top sources in Downing Street again? It's all right for me and you. We can operate like this. We can fly blind. We can make it up as we go along. We can speak truth to power without worrying about power cutting us off.
Yes, but they need the BBC as much as the BBC needs them.
Do they, though?
If the BBC was just turned around and say, right, OK, we don't report anything that you issue. No press releases, no.
Well, then someone else, we'd come along. We'd grab that opportunity. It creates a vacuum into which all sorts of things will fill. And don't forget that some of the most eccentric elements of the British media are setting up their own outfits now because they don't think things are right-wing enough. So if we're boycotting the BBC because they're doing proper journalism, where are you going to go instead? Well, luckily Rupert Murdoch's setting up a new TV channel, so we'll be heading over there. And you're right, I just don't know, and I'm not entirely comfortable with the personalisation of your criticism, but I'm comfortable enough with it to let it stand. I think it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of scenario that you describe. And I remember on this programme, such as it is, I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's a major player in the bigger media machine. Of course I am, just pretending to be modest. But I do remember when I took a conscious decision. I mean, it was informed partly by self-interest and partly by principle. The self-interest was that the mid-morning show historically only really gets what's left over after the breakfast show. The breakfast show on a station like this will always get first dibs on big politicians. And then Boris Johnson was ordered by his aides never to come on with me again, because this was according to the Evening Standard. You're welcome to dispute it, but take it up with them. Because it generally didn't go very well for him when he did. And a combination of those two things just made me think, well, let's not bother with having politicians on. Partly because we wouldn't get the pick of the bunch, and partly because if you got them on and you did your job properly, they'd never come on again, which is how it should be. So I don't know. It's fine for me to do this, but if you're doing a show that's at the top of the day, news breaking show, you couldn't be arrogant enough to say, well, we'll do it without politicians. So even when Good Morning Britain was being boycotted by the Cabinet, they still clearly and demonstrably wanted the Cabinet to come on. You can't, I don't think. Look, I mean, I'd have a crack at it if the money was right, but I don't think you can say to the audience, we're never having any politicians on because I'm too mean to them. I don't know, actually. Maybe it'd be worth an experiment. If only we could find a billionaire to bankroll our little vanity TV projects instead of it always being the most right-wing people on the planet. 12:52 is the time. And I wonder if that is the thing. So, you know how I despair at people who've fallen for the notion that someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson is respectable or honourable in any way, or even intelligent, particularly. I was reading some comments from one of Johnson's tutors at Oxford about how appalling he was, which really resonated. But I think probably with David Cameron, I fell for it too. It's just different gradations of delusion, isn't it? So I can't remember. What was I like when Cameron was Prime Minister? Was I going after them? I was going after austerity all the time, but I don't think I went after him on a personal level. But his personal conduct has been, it would appear, absolutely despicable. Him indulging in precisely the sort of behaviour he swore to outlaw when he was campaigning to be your Prime Minister. It's a funny old world, isn't it? And there it is. I mean, the rhetorical question of the day is, what is the point of having an independent inquiry into what David Cameron has done if, A, it won't touch Boris Johnson, B, the last independent inquiry got rewritten, reportedly, because they didn't like what it had to say about racism, and C, the one into Priti Patel's bullying got chucked in the bin, causing the actual independent advisor on the ministerial code to resign in protest. What's the point of any of it? What's the point of journalism? Might just play some records tomorrow. Keith, bring your boxes in. Rachel's in Camborne. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my call. I got quite worked up about this Greensill business and David Cameron, because I understand that this company are actually financial backers for Liberty Steel.
That's correct.
And
they were.
Liberty Steel, I hail originally from South Yorkshire.
Right.
From Stocksbridge, and there is a specialist steel plant in Stocksbridge, which generations of my family have worked in. Great-grandfather, grandfather, father, uncles, nephews, mum in the kitchen at one stage.
Blimey.
And those jobs are currently under threat, and I know a lot of that's to do with the pandemic and business being sort of altered because of what's been going on with the pandemic. But the way that these things work, you know, and to hear of David Cameron lobbying for a company to try and shore this company up. On one hand, I'm conflicted, because I think if he'd have been successful and got some money and they hadn't gone to the wall, then perhaps
might have been
Liberty
good for Liberty Steel.
Yeah, it'd be better for them. But however, I think if you hold the highest public office in the land, you should be above and beyond reproach. And I believe that at local council level, every level.
Yeah, but I believe it as well, Rachel. I just wonder how much they laugh at people like us while they're filling their pockets.
I don't care if they do.
No, I don't care either, but I'd like to know.
Yeah, I think, hang on to your naivety. Hang on to your...
It's idealism, isn't it? One man's naivety is another man's idealism. Or woman.
Yeah, we just have to. We just have to keep holding that line, because you know, yeah, I know this independent inquiry that they're calling for into Greensville now. You know, you kind of roll your eyes a bit, thinking who's looking into who, and is it going to get anywhere? Maybe not. But if these things aren't highlighted, if something isn't done about it, if we don't sort of go on and on about it, and you're really good at going on about it.
Oh, you're very kind. I like to think I'm one of the best in the business.
Absolutely.
Going on about it since 2010.
We have to. We just have to, because God, the mire, the slimy mire that we would descend into if we don't.
You have reminded me of my all-time favourite Orwell quote from 1984.
Oh, Lord, I've read that book. Go on then, hit me with it. I can't remember every word in there.
There was truth and there was untruth. And if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad.
Oh, there you go. That'll do.
Just get it on a T-shirt, shouldn't we? Or at least a tea towel. Paging Scott Balcony. 12:57 is the time. Rachel, thank you so much. What a brilliant call. Frank's in Manchester. Frank, what's the point of having an inquiry? They binned the last one. No, they rewrote the last one because they didn't like what it said, and they binned the one before that because it would have meant chucking Priti Patel on the scrap heap for the second time in 4 years.
I love your quote from 1984. I think the word has been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. It can be a very lonely position while you ride it out. I mean, come on.
Go on.
I grew up in the days of Doff Cab, Tug Forelock.
Yes. Well, I think we all did, Frank. That's my lesson of the last few years, is those days never ended. They just got rebranded.
Yeah. I mean, when I was just starting senior school, we had Ernie Marples bringing in Richard Beeching from ICI to close the railways so that he could get his motorway contracts going.
I don't know about that.
Mr. Profumo and the girls.
You know, Profumo, and I know it's probably slightly mythologised, but you look at what do you do after leaving office, and he left office in profound disgrace, of course.
Yeah.
Well,
79, I was in a public sector industry.
Right.
And I got drafted onto the asset disposal side because of my reputation for getting things done.
Yeah.
Over the next few years, I found myself sitting around various tables while various MPs from a certain party came in to suggest that assets were directed in a certain direction and sold to certain companies so that they could fill their boots.
So what's the word then? Naive, idealistic, or have you got one of your own, bearing in mind this is a family programme?
Corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I often caveat it with moral corruption, because actual corruption is illegal. Corrupt acts are illegal, but that's... Oddly, I think that's the point that the fellow was making in that piece about the wealth trap, comparing it to tax avoidance. It's all perfectly legal. It's as if morality doesn't exist. And then, of course, these are the people who elbow you out of the way on the way into church. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. You're listening. Thank you, Frank. I'm cracking on only because I'm out of time. And because I'm out of time, that means it is Sheila Fogarty time.